Hi, Sean Munger here, and if you're watching this but have somehow made it here without seeing the big in-depth video that this is a companion piece to, it's called The Tools Cult History of the Amway Motivational Scam, I highly recommend that you go watch that one or at least skim through it first before you see this one. It is long, it is in-depth, but this video is intended as kind of a catch-all for issues that didn't make it into the master video or which are at best discussed separately without breaking up the flow of that main story. I mentioned at the beginning of that video that I am not an MLM survivor myself. My work on this topic doesn't come from the usual direction that a lot of content from the anti-MLM community comes from. There's a lot of great stuff out there from anti-MLM people, and I watch and subscribe to some of them. Shout out, for example, to the recovering Hunbot, who did an excellent video back in August 2022 profiling Dexter Yeager. I don't identify myself as primarily being in the anti-MLM community. I'm a historian, after all, and I got interested in this story because it's such a fascinating piece of recent American history. That said, I recognize that if this video gets any traction, and it might not, probably a significant amount of views will come from the anti-MLM sphere. I am sympathetic to the anti-MLM community. I know far too much about multi-level marketing to conclude anything other than the fact that these companies are a huge grift and terribly destructive to people's lives. So I salute the work of prominent anti-MLMers like Robert L. Fitzpatrick, whose book Ponzi-nomics is a really fantastic source. Also Roberta Blevins and her terrific Life After MLM podcast, and the aforementioned recovering Hunbot, all of whom I corresponded with during my research. So there's a couple things I want to touch on here. First, the use of the word cult. Second, what I left out of the main video and why. Third, probably least of interest to you, but vitally important, a discussion about sources. And fourth, where I think this story sits in the broader context of discourse about MLMs and pyramid schemes. An issue I did not address directly in the main video is the use of the word cult, which I'm sure some people will get their jockeys in a bunch over. I realize that word does have some problems attached to it. It's used imprecisely and pejoratively in everyday usage. However, the word cult is used by survivors themselves, and people who study this phenomenon, like Stephen Hassan, one of the generally acknowledged experts on this kind of thing, he also uses the word cult. Multi-level marketing, and particularly the Amway toolosphere, you might say, comes up so frequently in the discourse in these quarters that it seems to be bending over backwards to avoid labeling the Amway tools business as a cult. The three major texts of what I call the Amway apostates, that's Stephen Butterfield, who wrote The Cult of Free Enterprise, Ruth Carter, who wrote Behind the Smoke and Mirrors, and Eric Scheibler, who wrote The Merchants of Deception. All three of these texts spend considerable time discussing the issue of whether the tools business is a cult. Guess what? It probably is. You could add to this Phil Kearns' 1982 book, Fake It Till You Make It, the earliest apostate expose. And considering that Kern wrote earlier about the number one organization that just about everybody can agree was a cult, Jim Jones's The People's Temple, ironically, Kern co-wrote that book with Doug Weed. Anyway, I don't feel gun-shy about using the word cult in conjunction with the phenomenon of the Amway tools. In fact, Butterfield, whose book I personally think is the best of these texts, goes even farther and engages in a step-by-step analysis of whether the Amway tools business is a fascist organization, and he makes a strong case for that. I won't go into that here, but I suggest you read his book. Even with the main video being an hour 45, almost 2 hours long, there's a lot I left out, and I absolutely recognize that. Understand that the main story I was interested in telling was the origin of the tools cult in the 1960s, up to and finishing with the conflict between the tools kingpins and the Amway suits, which climaxed at that meeting in Miami in April 1983. I am, so far as I know, the first historian to tackle that story specifically as a standalone subject. So to that end, one thing that I left out was very much about what the Amway and the tools business is like today. As I said at the end, it does still exist. You can find a lot of stories about from modern MLM survivors, which talk about what Amway is like today. It's completely bizarre to me that so much of the structures that were developed as far back as the 1960s are still operating in the modern world. My understanding is that today, instead of cassette tapes, Amway uses sort of a streaming device, kind of like a private Spotify. That's how I've heard it described, where cultists get their daily fix of what kind of Cadillac do you want, a type of quote-unquote motivation. In the main video, my chronological cutoff was 1983, the time of the Miami showdown, with a brief epilogue from 1988 detailing how we know about the Amway Corporation's surrender to the tools cult kingpins. So if you're wondering why I didn't, for example, mention some of the numerous lawsuits against the tools kingpins in the 1990s, the Brig Hart case, for example, this is why. Most of these suits do follow the pattern that I did mention in Chapter 10. They're mostly disgruntled distributors either suing to try to get a bigger piece of the tools business or suing the whole Amway kit and caboodle for defrauding them. For similar reasons, the chronological cutoff, I left out a lot of stuff about Yeager and Britt that happened after 1983, including legal problems and allegations directed against them in the 1990s and 2000s. I did not mention the NBC Dateline story on Amway and the tools business, which aired in 2004. Basically, that was a slightly harder-hitting rerun of the 60-minute Soap and Hope story from 1983 that I did cover. And I left out anything about Quickstar, which was the short-lived internet-based alter ego of Amway that existed in the early 2000s, in an attempt to divert the public's attention away from the name Amway, which by that time had a lot of bad press trailing it. There are a couple of people who are big in the history of Amway and the tools cult who I didn't mention, and it might seem strange at first glance that I didn't mention them. Ron Puryear, for example. He was a distributor who built the very large worldwide Dream Builders network. A network, in this parlance, it's the Association of Downlines. Puryear was in Amway during the relevant time. He joined in 1972, I believe, and Worldwide Dream Builders was in existence by the late 70s. Puryear was undoubtedly a tools kingpin. His name is mentioned, in fact, in the Postma memo, one of the few individual distributors who is named. Given his prominence, I suspect that he might have been present at the Miami showdown. Then again, he might not have been, as he was West Coast, and I think most of the people at the Miami showdown were East Coast, but I just don't know whether he was there or not. Another big fish is Fred Hartice. He joined the business in 1973, and he was in Dexter Yeager's downline. Hartice was a tools kingpin, and again, might also have been present in Miami. I just don't know. But most of his notoriety within the Amway universe came later, when he feuded with Quickstar in the late 2000s and was eventually terminated. Another major subject that I left out of my video concerned Amway and the tools cult's expansion overseas. Now, a great deal has been written and studied about this. The Amway Corporation did plead guilty to tax fraud in Canada in 1983, so that was going on at the time of the main story, but it wasn't really that relevant to the central story of the tools cult. Dexter Yeager and his organizations did have a significant footprint overseas. For example, they appear to have successfully infiltrated the UK in the early 1970s. I corresponded with a researcher about that subject, but the sources on that story are fairly thin, and I decided that it was a distraction from the central narrative, so that's why I left it out. Amway's expansion into other countries, particularly in the 1990s and 2000s, is also well documented. There's the famous documentary film Welcome to Life, which Amway successfully got banned in Poland in 1997, mainly for copyright violations. You can find that on YouTube. Network 21, which is a big part of the tools cult overseas, wasn't founded till 1989, so that post-dates the main story. Amway's troubles with foreign governments, particularly China and most recently Japan, have been in the news much more recently, but again, all of that post-dates the central tools cult story that I wanted to tell. We historians often talk about a subject called historiography. Simply put, this is the history of history. It's documenting how a historical event is talked about and how what it's said changes over time. Amway and the Tools Cult does have a historiography. The earliest writings on this subject are artifacts of the cult itself, the books that the kingpins themselves and Amway corporate people, and also their various boosters and toadies, wrote to promote the whole business. I mentioned a couple of those in the main video, and some also appeared in my footnotes. These tend to be the books that Amway people themselves recommend to others. These books are basically vaporware. They're extremely thin on content, and they're basically produced on an assembly line. A chimpanzee at a typewriter could eventually bang one of these out. They consist of a lot of motivational bromides and, much more common, anecdotes about people, always cis-het and usually white married couples who started out poor and desperate and then grew rich and happy after joining Amway. In this category, you'll find the Touchstone Yeager book, Don't Let Anybody Steal Your Dream, which was actually written by Doug Weed, and the various vapid volumes by Charles Paul Kahn, which include The Winner's Circle, The Possible Dream, and An Uncommon Freedom. The latter book, which astonishingly spent significant time on the New York Times bestseller list, thanks to heavy promotion to Amway distributors. And also other minor motivational authors, not necessarily Amway people themselves, like Zig Ziglar and Og Mandino. I always want to call him Og Mandingo. Anyway, during the process of making these videos, I had to read more of these books than I ever wanted to. They're nauseating, basically written at a third grade reading level and absolutely bereft of any real substance. What makes it all the more astonishing is that in this period, the 70s, 80s, and 90s, these puppies sold by the truckload. They're less common now, but if you ever went over to a friend's house in the 1980s or 90s, especially if he was a middle-aged white guy, and if you saw books by Charles Paul Kahn, Zig Ziglar, and Og Mandingo in his bookshelf, you know for 100% sure that he'd been proselytized by the Amway Tools Cult. These books are to the Tools Cult what Dianetics is to Scientology, which is nothing less than a sacred text. The second wave of Amway historiography was what I described earlier, which I call the apostate texts, which came out between 1982 and 2004. I call them apostates because the authors of these books, Stephen Butterfield, Ruth Carter, which is a pseudonym, Phil Kern, Eric Scheibler, they were all members of the Tools Cult at one time or another. They eventually left the cult and wrote exposés, and they largely started the ball rolling on the modern anti-MLM movement. Of this second wave, the most well-known and influential book was Scheibler's Merchants of Deception, which came out in 2004. It's very in-depth, though not as well written as Stephen Butterfield's book. And both of them are mostly personal stories. They're the forerunners of today's anti-MLM videos, which also try with varying degrees of thoroughness to explain and dissect the Amway phenomenon as a whole. The third wave of Amway historiography was found on the internet, the very early internet. I'm talking 1990s and early 2000s. In this period, a number of blogs and websites went up exposing the Amway MLM scam and the Tools Cult. An example of this site is amquicks.info. Many of these were eventually taken down as a result, directly or indirectly, of legal actions by Amway, often copyright infringement. These were tactics similar to how the Church of Scientology attempted to wage a campaign against critical websites during the same period. The web was small enough at that time, again we're talking 1997, that you could theoretically have a chance of success at suppressing negative information. But with the explosion of social media at the end of the 2000s, that era is long over. Still, these sites, which tended to be clearinghouses of links, articles, and documents, often court cases, they are still very helpful, and they're still generally available through the archive.org Wayback Machine. The Miami Showdown tape and the Postma memo, my most important sources for this story, were originally posted on amquicks.info in the early to mid-2000s. Finally, in the 20-teens, we start to get some serious historical scholarship on the Amway phenomenon. A lot of the truly useful work in this space has been done not by tenured historians, but by graduate students. I used 4 PhD dissertations, ranging in time from 1985 to 2019 for my research. An interesting feature of the historical scholarship is that it tries to put the whole Amway thing into context. either as a modern outgrowth of the classic Yankee peddler of the 18th and 19th centuries, or else as one cog in the wheel of post-World War II American conservatism, particularly as it involved the evangelical religious right wing. Those are important stories, and I hope that more historians will take them up. As I said at the beginning of this video, while the story I'm telling in my main video overlaps a lot with subjects discussed by the anti-MLM community, I don't generally consider myself a part of that community. My focus, again, is on history and investigating the past. Many anti-MLMs position themselves as consumer advocates, and a lot of the work done in this space, again by very prominent people like Robert L. Fitzpatrick, faces the public in a cautionary way, trying to educate people so they don't get pulled in and waste their money and damage themselves and their families. I think that's very valuable work, and there's some great stuff out there that approaches it from that angle. Roberta Blevins' Life After MLM podcast, which I mentioned earlier and which I was a guest on, is a jewel in the crown in that space, in my opinion. She particularly showcases survivor stories, which are fascinating and terrifying. It really is astonishing the damage that the multi-level marketing industry has done to society, the economy, our political system, and countless ordinary people. I do hope that somebody finds what I've done useful in understanding how we got here. It's a very tangled and complicated story, and as I keep harping on, one that historians should be paying attention to. So thanks very much for watching. I'll be returning to some of my more usual subjects, such as ships and nautical history, in the next few videos. But as always, thanks for going with me on this journey.